Between 1792 and 1800, America built its most powerful house. But the people who built it were not free. Hundreds of enslaved black men were forced into swamps, sickness, and death. Some collapsed from fever, some vanished without records, some were buried without names. Their hands lifted the White House. Their lives were erased from history. This is not just a building. This is a crime scene of history. And the truth was buried to protect a national myth. If you want real history that textbooks hide, subscribe to this channel now. And tell me in the comments, which state are you watching from? In the year 1792, the land chosen to become the capital of the United States did not look powerful or grand. It was not a city. It was not even safe. It was a stretch of wild ground filled with thick forests, muddy paths, and dangerous swamps. The air was heavy, the water was dirty, and sickness spread easily. Yet this land was selected to hold the future symbol of American power. From the very beginning, the capital was built in a place where survival itself was a struggle. America was still a young nation, eager to prove itself to the world. Its leaders wanted a permanent capital that would represent strength, authority, and independence. Plans were drawn for wide streets, government buildings, and most importantly, a grand house for the president. This building would later be called the White House. It was meant to stand as a sign of freedom and democracy, but the people who made this vision real were not free at all. To prepare the land, hundreds of enslaved black men were brought to the site. They did not come by choice. They were forced, rented from slave owners in nearby Maryland and Virginia. The government paid money to the owners, not to the men who would actually do the work. These men were treated as tools, useful only as long as their bodies could hold up under extreme labor. The land itself was cruel. Swamps covered large areas, filled with insects and stagnant water. Mosquitoes carried deadly diseases. Malaria and yellow fever were common, and medical knowledge was limited. Enslaved men were sent into these swamps with basic tools. They cut trees, dug soil, and drained water while standing ankle-deep in mud for hours. Their clothes stayed wet. Their skin broke open. Infections spread quickly. Work began before sunrise and continued until the light disappeared. Overseers pushed the men to move faster, threatening punishment if they slowed down. There was no concern for safety. If someone collapsed from exhaustion, he was dragged aside or replaced. Pain was normal. Sickness was expected. Death was accepted. Many enslaved workers became ill within weeks. Fevers burned through their bodies. Some lost the strength to stand. When men became too sick to work, they were often sent away or left behind. Some disappeared from records completely. There were no death certificates, no proper burials, and no official acknowledgement. These men simply vanished, as if they had never existed. Clearing the land was one of the most dangerous tasks. Massive trees had to be cut by hand. Roots were pulled from the earth using raw strength. Soil had to be leveled to make room for foundations. Accidents were common. A falling tree could crush a man instantly. A slip in the mud could lead to broken bones. Injuries that might have been survivable with care often became fatal. Food was poor and limited. Meals were simple and often not enough to support such hard labor. Clean water was rare. Shelter was temporary, made of rough materials that offered little protection from weather or disease. At night, the men slept exhausted, knowing the next day would bring the same suffering. Despite these conditions, the work continued. The land slowly changed shape. Forests disappeared, swamps were reduced, paths formed where there had once been only mud. The future capital began to emerge, not through freedom or equality, but through forced labor. What makes this history even darker is how carefully it was hidden.
Official documents recorded payments to slave owners, but rarely named the men themselves. When names did appear, they were incomplete or misspelled. When men died, there was no ceremony, no marker, no public record. Their bodies were buried without names, often near the work site or in unmarked ground. This silence was not accidental. A nation built on ideas of liberty could not openly admit that its capital was constructed through slavery. A powerful myth was forming, one that showed America as a land of freedom from its very foundation. Acknowledging enslaved labor would have cracked that image. While politicians debated laws and spoke about independence, enslaved black men fought to survive each day. They carried the weight of the nation on their backs while being denied any share in it. Their pain was unseen by the public and ignored by those in power. By the time the land was ready for construction, many of the original workers were gone. Some had died, some were sent back broken and ill, some simply disappeared, erased from memory. New men replaced them, and the cycle continued. The capital kept rising, and the truth sank deeper into the ground. The capital of the United States was not born clean or noble. It was shaped in mud and suffering. Its earliest foundations were laid by men who were chained by law and forgotten by history. The swamps were drained, but the blood and pain remained beneath the soil. This is how the story truly begins, not with marble buildings or proud speeches, but with enslaved black men standing in disease-filled swamps, forced to build a symbol that would never protect them. The capital was built on swamps and chains, and the cost was paid in human lives that history tried to erase.
Between 1792 and 1800, the building of America's capital did not depend on free workers as the nation claimed to believe in freedom. Instead, the government chose an easier and cheaper path. It relied on slavery. Enslaved black men were not hired as workers. They were rented like property. Their lives were temporarily borrowed, used, and then returned or discarded. Officials in charge of construction contacted plantation owners in Maryland and Virginia. Letters were written asking for strong enslaved men who could perform heavy labor. Owners agreed quickly because it meant money without long-term risk. They were paid by the government for each enslaved man sent to Washington. The payments were carefully recorded. The owners' names were written clearly. The enslaved men's names were often shortened, misspelled, or not written at all. For the men themselves, there was no choice. They were ordered to leave their plantations and walk toward an unknown place. Many had never traveled far from home. They left behind families, wives, children, parents, without knowing when or if they would return. No one explained how long they would be gone. No one promised safety. They were simply told to go. When they arrived at the construction site, reality hit hard. The work was harsher than plantation labor. Days were longer, conditions were worse. Overseers did not know them and did not care about their survival beyond daily productivity. These men were not considered individuals, they were counted as numbers. The system was designed to protect the image of the government. By renting enslaved men instead of owning them directly, officials could claim distance from slavery. On paper, it looked like business contracts, not human suffering. But in reality, the government was deeply involved in slavery, benefiting directly from forced labor while pretending to stand above it. Many enslaved men quickly realized they were more replaceable here than anywhere else. On plantations, an owner might hesitate to overwork someone he owned for life. In Washington, overseers knew that if a man collapsed, another could be rented. If one died, the cost was not theirs to worry about. Men were pushed beyond their limits. Some were already weakened from previous labor. Others were young but unprepared for the swampy land and deadly diseases. When sickness struck, there was little patience. A sick worker was a useless worker. Some were sent back to plantations in worse condition than when they arrived. Others were simply removed from the site and never seen again. Records show payments made even after workers vanished. There are no notes explaining where those men went, no cause of death, no burial record. The system allowed people to disappear quietly. This silence protected everyone in power. The rented enslaved men understood that their lives were temporary tools. They slept knowing that injury or illness could end them. Escape was nearly impossible. They were surrounded by overseers, unfamiliar land, and the constant threat of punishment. Some still tried to run. Those who were caught faced brutal consequences. Their suffering was never written down. Food and shelter were barely enough to keep men standing. The government did not invest in proper care because these men were not an investment. They were rented labor, easily replaced. The goal was speed, not survival. What makes this part of history especially disturbing is how normal it was considered. Government officials discussed enslaved labor in calm, professional language. There was no moral debate recorded. Slavery was treated as a practical solution. Freedom was spoken of loudly, but only for white citizens. As the work continued, new enslaved men arrived while others disappeared. The workforce was constantly changing, making it harder for anyone to track individual lives. This was not an accident. A shifting workforce meant fewer questions, fewer names, less responsibility. The rented enslaved men built more than structures. They built a system of denial. Their forced labor allowed America to present itself as a young, noble nation while hiding the truth beneath contracts and paperwork. The government benefited from slavery while pretending to stand above it. Families left behind waited with no information. Some enslaved men returned months later, broken and sick. Others never came back. Their families were never told what happened. There were no explanations, no apologies, no compensation. Loss was treated as normal. The capital continued to rise. Streets formed, foundations deepened, and all of it depended on men who were never meant to be remembered. The system of rented enslaved labor was efficient, profitable, and cruel. It allowed the nation to build power while pretending innocence. This part of the story exposes a hard truth. The White House and the Capitol were not just built with enslaved labor. They were built using a system designed to erase responsibility. Enslaved black men were used, paid for through their owners, and then pushed out of history. America's power did not rise on freedom alone. It rose on rented lives, silent suffering, and deliberate forgetting. This was not a mistake of the time. It was a choice.
As the construction of the Capitol moved forward, the land itself became one of the deadliest enemies. What officials called progress was, for the enslaved black men on the ground, a daily fight against fever, mud, and slow death. The work site was surrounded by swamps, stagnant water, and thick humidity. These conditions created sickness that spread fast and killed quietly. Most of the enslaved men had never faced such an environment before. They were forced to work for hours in standing water while digging, draining, and leveling land. Mosquitoes covered their skin day and night. Bites turned into infections. Fevers followed. At the time, people did not fully understand how diseases spread, but they knew these swamps were dangerous. Still, the men were sent in anyway. Malaria and yellow fever were common. Symptoms began with chills and headaches, then grew worse. Bodies weakened quickly. Some men shook uncontrollably. Others burned with fever while still being forced to work. There was no real medical care. If a man could stand, he was expected to work. If he collapsed, he was considered useless. Mud made everything harder. The ground swallowed boots, slowed movement, and caused constant falls. Wagons tipped, tools slipped. Men strained their backs and legs trying to pull heavy loads through thick earth. Cuts and wounds stayed open because there was no clean water to wash them. Infection was almost guaranteed. Deaths did not always happen suddenly. Many men grew weaker over days or weeks. They became slower, quieter, thinner. Overseers noticed only that productivity dropped. Sympathy was rare. punishment was more common. Weakness was treated as disobedience. When a man became too sick to work, he was removed from the site. What happened next was rarely written down. Some were sent back to plantations, barely alive. Others were left to die nearby. Some simply vanished. Their names stopped appearing in records, and no one asked why. There were no hospitals for enslaved workers, no doctors assigned to care for them. Treatment, if any, depended on the owner who rented them out, not on the government using their bodies. This created a dangerous gap. Everyone involved could deny responsibility. Burials were quiet and unmarked. When a man died, there was no ceremony. Bodies were placed in shallow graves, often near the worksite or in forgotten land. No markers were placed, no names were carved. The ground closed, and the work continued. Other workers watched this happen. They saw men fall sick, disappear, and never return. Fear spread among them, but so did silence. Speaking up could bring punishment. Running away was nearly impossible. The land was unfamiliar, and patrols were constant. Survival meant endurance. The official records from this time are cold and incomplete. They show payments, deliveries, and progress. They do not show suffering. They do not explain why the workforce kept changing. They do not mention illness or death. This was not because deaths were rare, but because they were inconvenient. The government wanted speed. Delays cost money and reputation. Acknowledging death would raise questions, so silence became policy. Fever and disease were treated as background noise, not human tragedy. The swamp claimed more lives than tools or accidents ever could. Disease did what chains and whips began. It broke bodies quietly. It erased men without witnesses. Families never received answers. On plantations, wives waited. Children asked when fathers would return. Owners often said nothing. Sometimes they did not know. Sometimes they did not care. A man sent to Washington could disappear forever, and life on the plantation moved on as if he had never existed. Some enslaved men tried to hide sickness, fearing removal or punishment. They worked while burning with fever. This made illness spread even faster. Crowded sleeping areas turned into breeding grounds for disease. One sick body became many. The land itself seemed to resist being turned into a capital. Each step forward was paid for with human lives. Swamps were drained, but the cost was blood and breath. The soil absorbed more than water. It absorbed suffering. White officials rarely stepped into the worst areas. When they did, it was briefly. They did not live in the mud. They did not sleep among the sick. Distance allowed denial. From afar, the project looked successful. From the ground, it looked deadly. What makes this part of the story so painful is how predictable it was. Everyone knew the risks. Everyone saw the sickness, yet nothing changed. Enslaved black men were considered expendable. Their deaths were accepted as necessary losses in the creation of power. Over time, the land began to look different. Swamps shrank, ground hardened, foundations became visible. To outsiders, it appeared as progress, but beneath that progress lay uncounted graves and erased lives. The men who survived carried scars, physical and mental. They learned that their lives meant less than stone and dirt. They learned that silence protected those in charge, not those who suffered. This stage of the capital's creation reveals a truth that was buried for generations. America's most powerful buildings were not only built with enslaved labor, they were built through illness, neglect, and silent death. Fever, mud, and disease did not slow the project, they fueled it. The faster men died, the faster they were replaced. The nation grew stronger, while human lives faded into unmarked ground. The capital rose, but so did the number of forgotten dead, and history, for a long time, chose not to look down at where they were buried.
As the land was cleared and the foundations prepared, the next stage of building the capital demanded something even more brutal. Stone was needed, huge amounts of it, and once again, enslaved black men were forced to do the most dangerous work. This part of the project did not just exhaust bodies, it crushed them. The White House and other government buildings required strong sandstone. This stone was taken from quarries miles away from the construction site. Enslaved black men were sent into these quarries, where the work was heavy, loud, and deadly. They used simple hand tools to cut massive blocks from solid rock. There were no machines to protect them. Every strike of the hammer risked broken fingers, shattered bones, or worse. Quarry work demanded strength and skill. Many enslaved men had learned trades like stone cutting and masonry on plantations. Their knowledge made the project possible. Yet that same skill trapped them in the hardest roles. The better they were, the more they were used. Once the stone was cut, it had to be moved. Enslaved men loaded enormous blocks onto wagons and pulled them across rough roads toward Washington. The weight was extreme. Wagons often broke, animals collapsed. When that happened, men were ordered to take their place. Ropes dug into their shoulders, muscles tore, backs gave out. Accidents were constant. A stone slipping from a wagon could crush a man instantly. A misstep could trap a leg under thousands of pounds. Screams were common, but help was slow. If a man survived an accident, he was often left permanently injured. An injured enslaved man was seen as a problem, not a person. There was no compensation for injury, no rest period, no medical care. Men with crushed fingers were expected to continue working. Those who could not were removed. Their names stopped appearing in records. Their fate was rarely questioned. At the construction site, enslaved masons lifted these stones into place. They mixed mortar, climbed scaffolding, and set blocks by hand. One mistake could mean a fall from height or being struck by falling stone. Safety rules did not exist for enslaved workers. Speed mattered more than life. Overseers pushed constantly. Delays meant anger. Anger meant punishment. Fear kept men moving even when their bodies begged them to stop. Pain became normal. Blood on stone was ignored. The stone walls of the White House slowly rose. Each block fit carefully, shaped by skilled enslaved hands. These men understood angles, balance, and structure. Their work required intelligence and precision, yet they were denied recognition. Their craftsmanship was praised only when it served the building, never when it came to the builder. As bodies broke down, replacements arrived. New enslaved men took the place of those injured or dead. This cycle made it easy to hide loss. No one kept count of how many were crushed, crippled, or killed. The stone remained. The men disappeared. Burials continued without markers. Some bodies were buried near quarries, others near the construction site. Families were not informed. Plantation owners might receive partial payment or none at all. The enslaved man himself was already forgotten. What makes this stage especially cruel is that the stone still stands today. Tourists admire the walls, the columns, the strength of the structure. Few are told that those stones were lifted by men whose spines bent under the weight and whose lives were shortened by it. Official records praise architects and contractors. They list costs, delivery dates, and measurements. They do not mention crushed hands or broken backs. They do not record screams or deaths. Stone looks clean on paper. Enslaved men understood that the stone was more valued than they were.
If a block cracked, it was replaced carefully. If a man broke, he was removed quietly. This truth followed them every day. Some men tried to slow their pace to protect themselves. They were punished. Others worked harder, hoping obedience might bring mercy. It did not. The system had no room for mercy. The stone carried more than weight. It carried silence. Each wall became part of a lie that America's power was built through unity and freedom. The truth was heavier. Even after the stonework was finished, the damage remained. Survivors carried injuries for life. Pain followed them back to plantations. They returned weaker, unable to work as before. Some were sold. Some were punished. Their suffering did not end when the building rose. This part of the Capitol's creations shows how violence does not always need weapons. Weight, pressure, and neglect can destroy just as effectively. The stone did not only shape a building, it shaped broken lives. The White House is often described as strong and enduring. That strength came at a cost paid in black bodies. Each stone block rests on unseen suffering. America's most powerful symbol was lifted by hands that history tried to forget. But the stone remembers. It holds the marks of labor, pain, and loss. The walls still stand, the men do not, and for generations their crushing burden was hidden beneath praise and silence.
As the structure of the White House began to take its final shape, the work required more than raw strength. It required skill, patience, and deep knowledge. Enslaved black men were not only laborers, many were trained craftsmen. They were masons, bricklayers, carpenters, and sawyers. Without their expertise, the building could not have been completed. Yet the closer the White House came to standing tall, the more carefully these men were pushed into the shadows. Some enslaved men had learned skilled trades from a young age. On plantations, owners trained them to build houses, barns, and tools. This knowledge made them valuable. When the Capitol needed skilled workers, these men were chosen. They shaped stone, cut timber, and measured each detail with care. Their hands turned rough materials into a finished structure. Brick by brick, the White House rose. Enslaved bricklayers mixed mortar, aligned walls, and ensured balance. Carpenters cut beams, floors, and roof supports. Sawyers worked endlessly, cutting logs into usable wood. Each task required precision. A small mistake could weaken the entire building. These men carried the responsibility of perfection, even though they would never benefit from the result. Despite their skill, they were denied recognition. Official records credited white contractors and architects. Enslaved workers were listed, if at all, as property. Their names were often shortened or missing. Their expertise was hidden behind the names of others. The nation celebrated the building, not the builders. These men worked under constant pressure. Overseers demanded speed and accuracy at the same time. Mistakes were punished harshly. Fear followed them up scaffolding and across narrow beams. Falling could mean death, yet rest was rare. Many skilled enslaved men understood the deep irony of their work. They were creating a house meant to represent leadership, law, and democracy. Yet they themselves were denied every right promised by those ideas. They built doors they would never walk through freely. As the building neared completion, the effort to erase these men became more deliberate. Their presence did not fit the story the nation wanted to tell. America was presenting itself as a land of freedom to the world. Acknowledging that enslaved black men built its most important house would expose a painful truth. Some skilled workers were removed before completion. Once their task was finished, they were sent away. Others stayed until the end, only to disappear from records afterward. There were no thank yous, no payment, no memory preserved. Living conditions did not improve with the skill level. Whether skilled or unskilled, enslaved men lived in poor shelters and ate limited food. Injuries still went untreated. Skilled hands were not protected from harm. When illness or injury struck, skill did not save them. Many of these men left behind lasting marks on the building. They carved details, shaped arches, and fitted joints that still exist today. Their work has survived for centuries, even though their names did not. The building remembers them more than history did. Some skilled enslaved craftsmen took quiet pride in their work. In a world that denied their humanity, skill became a form of dignity. They knew the building stood because of them. That knowledge, though painful, was also a reminder of their worth. But pride did not protect them. Once the work was done, they were returned to plantations or sold elsewhere. Some were punished for injuries that reduced their ability to work. The government did not track what happened to them. Responsibility ended when the building stood. The erasure of these men was not accidental. It was planned through silence. By crediting others and ignoring the enslaved, the nation shaped a false memory. Future generations would see the White House as a symbol of unity, not exploitation. Even today, visitors admire the craftsmanship. They praise the design, the symmetry, the strength. Few are told who actually built it. Fewer still are taught that enslaved black men were central to every detail. This part of the story reveals a deeper injustice. It is one thing to steal labor. It is another to steal legacy. These men were denied both. Their hands shaped the White House. Their skill gave it life. Yet their identities were erased to protect a national image. The walls remain. The craftsmanship remains. The truth, for a long time, did not.
As the White House moved closer to completion, life for the enslaved black men did not improve. In fact, for many, it became even harder. While the building began to look strong and beautiful, the men behind it were growing weaker, sicker, and more invisible. This stage of the story is about how they lived, how they died, and how they were buried without names. The enslaved men lived in rough, temporary shelters near the construction site. These were not proper homes. They were simple structures made of wood scraps or canvas. Rain leaked through. Cold nights offered no protection. In summer, heat trapped inside made sleep almost impossible. Rest was never enough, even though the work drained every bit of strength from their bodies. Food was basic and limited. Meals were designed only to keep men standing, not healthy. Cornmeal, salted meat, and small portions were common. Clean drinking water was hard to find, especially near the swamps. Dirty water caused stomach illness and weakness. Hunger and sickness became part of daily life. Medical care was almost non-existent. There were no doctors assigned to care for enslaved workers. If a man became ill, he was expected to keep working as long as he could stand. Pain was ignored. Complaints were punished. Only when someone collapsed completely was he removed from the worksite. When a man became too sick or injured to work, his value disappeared. Some were sent back to plantations, often in worse condition than before. Others were left behind, unable to travel. Many died quietly, without witnesses. Their deaths were not announced. They were treated as inconveniences, not tragedies. Burials were simple and fast. There were no funerals, no prayers, no markers. Bodies were placed in shallow graves, often close to where the men had worked. Sometimes several were buried near each other, sometimes alone. The ground was marked only by memory, and memory faded quickly. Families were never informed. Wives and children waited on plantations, hoping for return. Days turned into months, months turned into years. Some never learned what happened. Silence became the only answer. The lack of records was deliberate.
Writing down deaths would raise questions. Questions would damage the image of progress and success. So names were removed. Lists stopped suddenly. A man's existence ended on paper long before it ended in the ground. Other enslaved workers saw this happen and understood the message clearly. Their lives could end without notice. Fear followed them every day, but fear did not stop the work. It forced obedience. Some men formed quiet bonds with each other. They shared food, whispered stories of home, and looked after the sick when they could. These small acts of care were forms of resistance. In a system designed to erase them, remembering each other was powerful. But even these bonds were fragile. The workforce changed constantly. Men arrived, men vanished. It was hard to keep track of who was gone and why. This confusion helped erase responsibility. White officials rarely saw the living conditions. When they did not stay long. Distance allowed comfort. Comfort allowed denial. As long as the building progressed, the suffering below it did not matter. The government focused on deadlines and costs. Human life did not appear in reports. Death was not considered a failure. Delay was. As the White House neared completion, public attention grew. The nation prepared to celebrate a symbol of strength and leadership. But beneath that celebration lay unmarked graves and broken lives. The men who survived carried trauma with them. They returned to plantations with weakened bodies and deep scars. Some could no longer perform heavy labor. Instead of care, they faced punishment or sale. Their suffering continued long after the Capitol stood. This part of the story reveals the final cruelty of slavery in the Capitol's construction. It was not just forced labor, it was forced disappearance. Men were worked until they broke, then erased. The White House became a place of power, speeches, and laws. The men who built it were denied even a name in death. For generations, the ground around the Capitol held secrets. Beneath walkways and lawns lay forgotten bodies. No markers told their stories. No monuments honored them. Only much later did historians begin to uncover fragments of the truth. Payment records, broken lists, sudden gaps. These small clues pointed to lives lost and buried without acknowledgement. This silence protected a national myth. A myth that America was built cleanly, nobly, and freely. The truth threatened that story. The enslaved black men who died building the White House were not accidents of history. Their deaths were the result of choices. Choices to ignore suffering. Choices to value stone over life. Choices to erase rather than remember. This is why unmarked graves matter. They remind us that history is not only written in books, but buried in the ground. The White House stands above that ground, powerful and proud. But beneath it lies another foundation, one made of silence, suffering, and forgotten lives. This part forces us to face what was hidden, that America's most important house was built not just by enslaved hands, but over enslaved bodies. The men were buried without markers, but their story cannot stay buried forever. As the White House neared completion around 1800, the focus of leaders and officials shifted. The hard labor was mostly done. The walls stood tall. The roof was in place. Now the nation prepared to present this building to the world. What followed was not just celebration, it was a careful rewriting of the truth. America wanted a symbol. The White House was meant to show power, order, and democracy. It was supposed to represent a new nation built on freedom and law. But the real story behind its construction did not match this image. Hundreds of enslaved black men had built it under brutal conditions. Many had suffered. Many had died. This truth threatened the story America wanted to tell. So the truth was pushed aside. Officials began shaping a clean narrative. Records highlighted architects, planners, and white contractors. Speeches praised vision and leadership. The language was proud and hopeful. There was no mention of chains, sickness, or unmarked graves. Enslaved labor was quietly removed from public memory. This erasure was not accidental, it was necessary. A nation that claimed liberty could not admit that its most powerful house was built through slavery. To protect the national myth, the workers had to disappear. Documents were selective. Payment records showed money given to slave owners, not to the men who worked. Names of enslaved laborers were shortened, misspelled, or removed. Gaps appeared where deaths and disappearances should have been explained. Silence replaced truth. As presidents prepared to move into the White House, no enslaved builder was invited to witness the result of his labor. The building opened without acknowledgement of those who made it possible. The celebration belonged only to the powerful. The men who survived were returned to plantations or sold elsewhere. Their role in history ended the moment the work ended. No effort was made to record their experiences. No attempt was made to honor their sacrifice. Their story no longer served the nation's image. Over time, this false version of history hardened. Textbooks spoke of democracy and leadership. Tour guides praised architecture and design. Generations passed without learning who actually built the White House. The silence became normal. This forgetting helped shape American identity. The White House stood as proof of national greatness, not national contradiction. The myth worked because it was repeated. What is not said can be just as powerful as what is said. Meanwhile, the descendants of enslaved people carried stories passed down quietly, whispers of men who went away to build something important and never came back. These stories survived outside official history, kept alive by memory instead of documents. The government benefited from this erasure. By denying enslaved labor, it avoided responsibility. It avoided moral judgment. It avoided facing the truth that slavery was not a side issue, it was central to the nation's foundation. Even when slavery ended decades later, the story of the White House did not change. Freedom was celebrated without correcting the past. The myth stayed intact. The building itself became sacred. Criticizing its origins was seen as disrespectful or unpatriotic. Questioning the story meant questioning the nation. This made silence easier. But silence has a cost. It turns suffering into nothing. It turns lives into shadows. It allows injustice to be repeated. This part of the story shows us that history is not only shaped by events, but by choices about what to remember. America chose to remember power and forget pain. It chose to celebrate stone and ignore blood. The erasure of enslaved builders was an act of protection, not of people, but of image. The White House needed to look clean, even if it was built dirty. Only much later did historians begin to challenge this myth. They searched old records, payment lists, and letters. They noticed missing names. They noticed patterns of disappearance. Slowly, the truth began to surface. But for generations, the lie had already done its work. The White House stood as a symbol of freedom while hiding its origins. Enslaved black men were written out so the nation could feel comfortable with its own story. This part forces us to understand that forgetting is powerful. It can erase suffering as completely as chains erase freedom. The denial of enslaved labor was not just about the past, it shaped how America saw itself. The truth was buried to save the myth, and that myth became the foundation of national pride. The White House was finished, the story was edited, and the men who built it were erased, not by accident, but by design.
Today, the White House stands as one of the most powerful buildings in the world. Leaders walk its halls. Decisions made inside it affect millions of lives. Cameras, flags, and ceremonies presented as a symbol of democracy and authority. But beneath this image lies a truth that was hidden for centuries. The White House is not just a seat of power. It is a silent witness to injustice. For a long time, the story of how the White House was built was incomplete. History books focused on presidents, architects, and political success. They spoke of vision and progress. They did not speak of the hundreds of enslaved black men who cleared the land, cut the stone, lifted the walls, and paid with their health and lives. Those men had no voice. They left no diaries, no letters, no monuments. Their suffering was not recorded in speeches or celebrations. Instead, it was buried beneath stone and silence. As generations passed, the myth grew stronger. The White House became a clean symbol, separated from the violence that created it. Questioning its origins was uncomfortable, so it was avoided. Silence felt easier than truth. But silence does not erase reality. It only delays it. In recent decades, historians began to look closer. They searched old government records, payment lists, and letters. They noticed something strange. Slave owners were named clearly. Payments were detailed. But the workers themselves were barely mentioned. Names appeared briefly and then disappeared. Gaps appeared where people should have been. These gaps told a story. They revealed that hundreds of enslaved black men worked on the White House between 1792 and 1800. Many fell sick, many vanished from records. Many died under brutal conditions. Their bodies were buried without markers. Their labor was officially denied. This was not neglect, it was deliberate erasure. The truth slowly came into light. Museums, historians, and educators began to acknowledge what had been hidden. For the first time, the nation started to admit that slavery was not just part of American history, it was part of American power. This does not change the building itself. The White House still stands, but it changes how we see it. When people walk past its walls today, they are also walking past the unmarked graves of history. The ground holds stories that were never told. Every stone carries memory. Calling the White House a crime scene of history does not mean blaming the present for the past. It means refusing to lie about how power was built. It means recognizing that freedom for some was created through suffering for others. The enslaved men who built the White House were not weak. They survived impossible conditions. They carried knowledge, skill, and strength. They built something meant to last forever, even though they were denied a future. Their erasure was meant to protect a national myth, that America was born clean and just. But no nation grows without contradiction. Facing that truth does not weaken a country, it strengthens it. For too long, these men were invisible. Their names were removed. Their deaths were ignored. Their role was denied. But history has a way of resurfacing. This final part is not just about the past, it is about responsibility. Remembering these men means acknowledging that symbols can lie, and that power often hides its cost. The White House will continue to be a place of speeches and decisions, but it should also be a place of memory, a reminder that democracy was built by people who were denied it. Their story forces us to ask hard questions. Who builds power? Who benefits from it? And who is forgotten when the story is told? The men who built the White House were erased to protect a lie. Bringing them back into history does not destroy America's story, it completes it. They were buried without markers, but they are no longer without voice. The White House stands tall, and now, finally, the truth stands with it.